Hello, everybody. My name is Issi, Professor Issi Doron. I'm a gerontologist, or more specifically a jurisprudential gerontologist, meaning I specialize in the field of law and aging in human rights of older persons. I would like to thank the organizers and funders of this excellent meeting, in specific to my colleagues, Professor Perla Werner and Professor Silke Schicktanz, for allowing me and giving me the honor and pleasure to give this presentation. This presentation is actually going to be not about the actual ability or the accuracy of various procedures and diagnosis about early prediction of dementia. Moreover, I'm not going to provide answers. As I will argue later on, the answers to the questions I will pose are actually very complicated and may differ from country to country or culture to culture. So my main purpose of this presentation is actually to raise questions, raise both ethical and legal questions about the context of dementia prediction and where we are going in this field. I must admit that, like most of us, we realize that dementia prediction is a double-sword phenomenon, in the sense that it has many positive aspects to it. It can allow people to plan, it can allow people to talk, it can allow people to realize and think about their future selves. However, in this presentation, unfortunately, I will focus mainly, because of the legal and ethical dementia, the dimension of this process is about the negative or dark side of these aspects that I will show you. I also would like to emphasize two more preliminary points. First, we need to distinguish between ethical, what is right and wrong, and the legal, what we must or not do from a legal perspective, meaning the legal element is binding, and once we make it under a law, we simply have to follow what the order of the law are, unlike the ethical dimensions, which many times leave us with some kind of discretion and moral discretion, which may differ between professions and people in person. So I will talk both about the ethical and legal aspects of it. Finally, it is interesting to note in this context that while there are many important international standards and binding conventions, for example, the human rights of women, children, persons with disabilities, we don't have such an international standard in the context of human rights of older persons in general, and more specifically, we don't have any international binding standards in the context of the human rights of persons with dementia in specific. And this is one of the issues and challenges that we have in this field. So let's move forward. Let me begin with raising some of the dark sides of dementia prediction, once again, while being aware of the many positive potential aspects to that as well. First of all, I would like to mention the fact of what we call Alzheimerism. And again, Professor Perla Werner is one of the experts in these fields. Unfortunately, the mere fact that you have the title of, for example, being with Alzheimer's, and interestingly enough, even if you are not with dementia or Alzheimer's, but the mere fact that you have been diagnosed with a higher risk of having dementia or Alzheimer's in later life, this and in of itself erases a whole range of stereotypes, stigma, and biases against you simply because of that diagnosis. However, it is not only thoughts and beliefs and stereotypes, it's actual discrimination. And this discrimination can have many aspects and many examples. We can start in the health insurance and other legal insurances. So for example, if you have been diagnosed or examined and found to be in higher risk in later life, long-term care insurances can refuse to insure you. They will not give you a disability or life insurance simply because of this futuristic diagnosis. In cases of scarce resources, for example, in the reality of today, if there are not enough ventilators, if there are not enough vaccinations, it is clear that in some contexts, people who are healthy and young will be excluded or be referred to lower lists because of the fact that compared to healthier or younger people without that diagnosis or dementia prediction, they should not receive these very expensive and scarce resources compared to other people. The labor field and employment field is a natural arena for these kinds of discriminatory behaviors, both in the screening process when recruiting people and future employees, then if the employee shows or is required to go these tests and be found to be in higher risk of having dementia in later life, then employers will not recruit him. And even during the employment life, then once such an employee is diagnosed, then potentially his advancement in his work will be infringed and he will be discriminated, he or she. This can also go to the personal relationships. What about children? What about partners? What about family members who would know or would want to know about such predictions and examinations? And what about legal privileges, for example, driving license or disability entitlements? And how about being victim or targeted as a potential victim to financial abuse? You can also think about the aspects of self-Alzheimerism, the internalization of the social expectation of, even if you're young and healthy, but the knowledge of or being aware of the fact that you might have a higher risk of dementia in later age. You might change your behavior or internalize, for example, in the context of both depression or some kind of determinism about your fate of life because of it. You may deny it or even make some self-harm because of it. We must also be aware of the fact that once these examination and novel processes of predictions will get higher and higher profile, there will be a growing social pressure of people, even in Friday evening talks around the table. So have you taken that exam? What were the results? Why don't you take that exam? What are you afraid of? So the whole pressure of doing it. And finally, once you have done it, and once, if unfortunately you have been found to have a higher risk of having dementia, all the pressure of to socially behave appropriately. So stop driving, don't have new relationships, doing all stuff that is once again socially constructed as the proper behavior, as being diagnosed with a future risk of dementia in any sort of kind. So, what are the key legal issues in this context of, as I very shortly and quickly present, the dark side of these exams and tests which may allow dementia prediction? I think the foremost and the first and most important aspect is naturally the issue of autonomy. Again, autonomy is the core essence of the human dignity, I would argue. So in that context, what are the implications regarding our freedom, our liberty and choice regarding the ability to have, to choose, and to consent to having dementia prediction exams, tests, etc. Naturally, the first question is who decides? Who decides to have a dementia prediction test? And what is needed and what is the information and what is the context which makes this decision truly and fully free, meaning not an outcome of a societal pressure. A different question is, are there certain circumstances when a person has to be mandated or required to have such tests, for example, as a part of looking for a job? And who and how decides to let a person know about the outcomes of these tests? What are the ethics of disclosing such a diagnosis? What are the procedures? What are the requirements? So once again, the whole issue of freedom of choice and its actual contextual meaning within the process of a world that has and will have more and more accurate and more sophisticated test diagnosis is very crucial in this context. And finally, in the context of the ownership, can we destroy, or as the person has the right to destroy or eliminate the data regarding the test and exam? And what are the duties in that context for the providers and the people who actually execute and have the knowledge about all these predictions? The second crucial and well-known issues around these kinds of tests and exams are all the issues around privacy, secrecy, and confidentiality. And once again, these are well-known issues generally, but they do have some specific and more unique aspect within dementia prediction. So for example, once there are determinations who is the legal owner and who controls the data, how safely is it kept, who has the legal right to access it, can public bodies access it, for example, police or secret agents, or driving authorities and public bodies, regulatory bodies like that. What about private bodies? So for example, private insurance companies, life insurance companies, employers and private employers. And what about family members, my wife, my children, my future partners and colleagues? And if we do agree that the secrecy and privacy and confidentiality factors are not total, what should be the grounds to justify breaching, and in what context is there a legitimate right to infringe the rights of privacy and confidentiality? One has to keep in mind that there are much broader legal policies around these topics. So for example, when we know that there is no specific law as of today regarding these diagnostic tests and procedures, and we realize that there is a need for a specific legal regulation in the field, what are the reference points and what should we look into? So for example, should there be a legal regulation for all these procedures about early detection and early prediction tests? So for example, do we need to require license to the professionals who work in this field? What are the requirements for having such a license in these fields? Who and how decides to give these licenses for the people who make these tests and procedures? What about the legal status of people who have been diagnosed and have the knowledge of their future risk of having dementia? So for example, does their legal status change from a fully capable person to semi-capable person? So for example, are they entitled for some kinds of disability rights on the one hand? On the other hand, do they lose their legal capacity to make all kinds of contractual engagements? What about the tort liability for third parties? For example, both the personal liability of the person, him or herself, or the liability of the people who have executed the exam and tests and know and have the knowledge and maybe have a legal duty to protect both society or third party like family members, potential employers or financial institutions. And finally, if we want to frame this issue in a human rights perspective, what are the broad fundamental human rights of people with early prediction of dementia? Do they and will they have specific human rights in that study? So again, in this short presentation, I cannot and did not provide answer. However, I would to provide some insights for moving forward in this field. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't think there are single and simple answers to the various questions I have raised. So here are my personal insights. First of all, from my perspective, it is clear that it is time not only to discuss the ethical and legal implication of dementia prediction, but also to actually start doing something about it. So I think it is time that we will have legislation and regulation, and we need to move forward. Second of all, it is clear that dementia prediction raises not only numerous ethical and legal questions, but they raise real and significant dilemmas, which, if left unregulated, may cause serious harm. I think that learning from past experience in specific genetic testing, and here in Israel, we have such a legislation in the context of genetic testing from the early 2000s, it is clear that the basic approach needs to be a human rights approach, i.e. that the person is in the center and his or her basic and fundamental rights, meaning autonomy, freedom of choice, privacy, equality, and prevention of discrimination should be at the core of any legal and ethical regulation in this field. In this spirit, I would like to add another important insight, that the voice of people with dementia should be heard and taken into account in any regulatory process. And finally, in light of the growing intersectionality between ableism and ageism, disability and old age, and Alzheimerism, it is crucial not to believe that if we can simply wait, the potential dangers right now are already too high. So we need to act, and we need to start not only think, talk, but also to actually regulate, legislate, and enact. Thank you very much. My true apologies for not staying for the discussion due to personal restrictions, but once again, many thanks to all of you, and all the best.